You are in for an interesting ride.
Hi, folks, and welcome to another ET Newsroom interview. This is another shortish one, and I am Joanna Summerscales, your host. The ET Newsroom is a platform for those wishing to share their stories and is, in fact, soft disclosure. That is, disclosure with exposure. In this case, we are meeting David Tame, who hails from Coventry in England, and he has an interesting story because he said, my goodness, Joanne, I didn't expect to be putting some dots together after I turned 70 to realise there was something going on linked with ET. So let's see what David has to share. So hello, David Tame. Welcome to the ET Newsroom. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bio, a little history. Then what made you realise that there was possibly something of an extraterrestrial or otherworldly element to your life experiences along the way?
Okay, I was born in 1953. My parents got married after World War II, and my mother had a miscarriage. She was told at the time she wouldn't be able to have children, which was probably quite a blow at the time because in those days, post-war, everybody was having children. And I somehow came along and must have been a great thrill to them. But I wasn't spoiled. I had a great childhood and my parents were very much in love. They were wonderful parents and my childhood was perfect. It was kind of idyllic. My father did die young when I was 12, when he was 44, of a heart attack. So things went a bit different then. But the first 12 years of my life were idyllic, really. We weren't well off, working class, but everybody around us were the same. Went through my teens and I came across the subject at the age of 12. In those days, you could walk around all the housing estate around me and ask somebody, what do you think of UFOs? Nobody would know what you were talking about. Nobody had heard of UFOs. Nobody had heard of anything like that being real. Nobody had heard of seeing occupants. Nobody had heard of abductions. It was just totally unknown in those days. About the age of 20, I decided I sacrificed 10 years of my life, not looking after my career, but to working for spiritual charity work, which was unpaid. So I had to work twice as hard and do any kind of job in my 20s just to earn the money to pay the bills.
You indicated that from a very young age, you were a deeply spiritually aware person, which is very unusual, I think, because it didn't come from your, parenting, didn't come from indoctrination. So I'm guessing this was some kind of wellspring within you. And tell us a bit about what you did. You said you sacrificed 10 years. That's quite a strong phrase. So what exactly did you do?
Well, rather than bother too much about my A levels, which you do it when you're 17, 18 years old, and rather than go to university, the pressing question to me is there a meaning to life? And basically, I set myself more than full-time search, reading books, traveling. And from the age of 20, I traveled a lot. Some people in those days used to do the overland journey all the way to India. And I did that from the age of 21 to 22. And it was totally transformational. But I was going there for a purpose. I was looking for certain teachers and I found them. I was then guided what to do and had somebody to tell me. That's been the story of my life.
Kind of went on a quest then for the meaning of your life. What was the information or support that these teachers that you found in India and I guess elsewhere offered?
It turned out they're not just in India, that you can find them. It's a kind of a network around the world, not necessarily just physical, but they are ever present. And it's more the UFO subject I would go into because the spiritual or esoteric aspect is more private to my life. You don't talk about it too much. The more you talk about it, you're meant to kind of keep it to yourself, really, you know. But I had a transformation around the age of 20 because I don't know why, but not having been brought up in any religion, all I knew around me was Christianity. It didn't make logical sense to me. And so I was a devout materialist reductionist. I didn't believe in anything unless you could touch it or see it. And I remember a couple of people got really frustrated with me because they did know about, auras and healing and spirits, if you want to use the word. And I was like, no, don't talk nonsense, you know. And then around the age of 20, it all hit me and things happened to me, and it happened very quickly.
Oh, go on, David. Do give us a little bit more of a hint about what happened at 20.
Well, I was looking and I was open-minded, and I thought, well, if there's no purpose to life at all, and I don't find there is one, I'll just have to accept it. But if there is, I need to find it. And I came across a book. There was a tiny little group of about 3 people. I grew up in the city of Coventry, and I'm back there now after decades away. And there was a little tiny group of 3 of Theosophy, which is like an old organization by now. And they didn't really know much, but they had a great library, and you could borrow from their library. And one book was called The Masters and the Path by Charles Leadbitter. And it told you everything about what he discovered about what he called Mahatmas, or great masters, in India and the Himalayas. They're really everywhere, but I gained the false impression you had to go to the Himalayas to find them. So I went off overland to the Himalayas. They kind of put me in touch. There's a phrase that the student is ready, the master appears. Boy, I was searching for them. I was going all over India, reading books, and eventually I found the clue of how to find them.
I read a book called The Life and Teaching of the Masters of the Far East, and I'd been on the fence about the reality of, say, Jesus and Buddha and those guys and girls. This guy, Bertie Spalding, back in the late 1800s, he actually went to India with 1 or 2 other people. Now, he was coming from a scientific point of view, and he was an engineer. He and his compatriots were miners, engineers, all that kind of thing. But his grandfather had gone to India before him and had somehow come across, through circuitous means, ancient texts, which he was given access to. And Bertie Spalding was going to go and translate some of those. And indeed, I believe he did, but we have no idea now of where those texts that he translated might be, and the translations. But he actually met in person Jesus, Buddha, and myriad other masters, male and female, and describes the most incredible journey and what we would call miracles. I don't know if I would call them miracles myself, because I understand, though I don't know the mechanics, that there's a different set of rules and laws in operation for them to do what they did. And I can recommend anybody, it's not a religious tome at all, it's nothing to do with that. It's a story about a traveller, Bertie Spalding, and the books, these 6 tomes, are taken from his journal. He wasn't even, I can quite understand when you say, when the student's ready, the master appears, because these guys saw Jesus and those other many masters relatively soon into his journey. Turned me from being on the fence to Jesus was a material person and still is and can manifest, and it really did open my eyes, and I recommend those books.
I know the books well. Oh, they're very, very famous in the past, at least. And if you wanted a bit more insight, when he passed on, his closest friend was named David Bruton, Bruton. He wrote his account of knowing Bertie Spalding in his last years. And that gives a whole different perspective. But it's the kind of journey I was on too. It's quite similar.
Again, I didn't know that there was somebody else who knew him and had written something so fantastic. I think it's important for people to know that there are these other dimensional frequencies or ranges of laws that to penetrate our dimension, our 3D world, and be material and impact deeply and materially the presence, everything from bringing food out of the ethers to suddenly finding yourself from one location to another in an instant, or protected from some danger in an instant.
Okay, well, I said that my childhood was idyllic until the age of 12, and I don't mean it went terrible after that. You think you know your childhood. I came across the subject of UFOs when I was 12, and it hit me really, it was amazing. And when I came across it, I just dived in and became deeply involved straight away. I subscribed to before the days of the internet, there were journals you could subscribe to, and I was getting them all. And I had a pile like this much to read through straight away. And I was getting all the latest books. And this was 1965 when I was 12. And it's the year the famous researcher Jacques Vallée, as a young man, brought his first book out called Anatomy of a Phenomenon. And I got that. From 1965, for 58 years until 2 years ago, I'd been aware of the UFO subject on and off, because sometimes you're very busy doing something else for a number of years. I mean, I've read thousands and thousands of UFO sightings, hundreds of accounts of abductions, read an awful lot, and today you've got the internet. But something happened 20 months ago. It's now June 2025, and in October 2023, I don't remember the train of thought that led me there, but I was sitting at home and somehow I started to realize something, and it was like putting dots together. I'm talking of memories, and I had just a few memories which had been floating around from my childhood, and I only put them together when I just recently turned 70 years old. So it was 20 months ago, October 2023, and I suddenly linked all these dots together. And here's me. I'd spent 58 years knowing about UFOs, reading the books on abductions. And I sat there, and I think I spent a whole afternoon totally stunned, because I joined a few dots together and realized it had happened to me. And for 58 years, I thought I'd just been reading about other people's experiences. And now I realize I've got a childhood which I remember, and it was wonderful, it was good, but there's a curtain, and behind that curtain, there's a whole other part of my childhood. And I don't remember any of it consciously, but there are certain little clues which, when you put them together, you can only come to one conclusion. So I don't have a spectacular story to tell about consciously being taken by alien beings on a regular basis, or being able to describe being on a craft and what it was like. All that kind of thing is wiped. But I can tell you about these clues which came to me, and I put them all together 20 months ago. So we moved into a new home when I was 4 years old. I was there for 10 years, from the age of 4 to 14. And all this happened when I was there. The first thing I would say, the first thing that happened that I remember, I was between the age of 4 and 7. And narrowing it down, I would say I was probably 5 or 6 years old. And being an only child, I had my own bedroom. And I went to bed one night, and I lay in bed and looked to the left of me, and to the left there was a wardrobe. The wardrobe kind of looked like this. It was a double door wardrobe. So you've got one door here, one door there. And it had this pattern of relief. This was wood, which kind of came outwards, these two ovals. And the door handles were here, and the keyhole was here. And looking at the wardrobe, in a moment, it transfigured and changed into the face of a being. And these became the eyes. And after that, I wasn't really looking at the nose or the mouth, and I didn't really look at the body, but I was looking at these two huge eyes, and it started walking towards me. And the way walking goes, the left leg went forward, and the right leg, and the left leg, and the right leg. So it was approaching me. The strange thing was, although it was approaching me, it got to a certain point, and it was still doing this walking movement, but it wasn't getting any closer. It was about 3 or 4 feet away, very near, but it wasn't getting any closer. I mean, I could hardly forget that, because by far and away, it's the most terrified I've ever been in my life. I was a little boy, and this thing was approaching my bed, and I was paralyzed with fear, and I was able to scream, and I screamed and I screamed and I screamed, not able to scream words, just screams. And I think if I'd been more terrified than that, I would have passed out. It's as scared as you could possibly be. And I've never experienced anything like that emotion before or ever since in my life. The screams brought my mother, and she opened the bedroom door. And the moment she came in, this thing vanished. And all of a sudden, everything was okay. And somehow I fell asleep, but remembered, of course, in the morning. And I was quite rational as a child, although I was only probably 5 or 6 years old. And I was very annoyed with myself, because I thought, well, that was an hallucination. I imagined it, but it seemed so real. And I couldn't believe I would make up a thing like that it could happen to me.
Can I just
But I put
ask
it down as being an hallucination.
that you're referencing the archetypal grey?
Yeah, well, I recognise that now. But in the 1950s, nobody had that archetype. Nobody knew of abductions. So it was totally unknown. This came to me later, when I was a bit older, that I realised when I was reading the literature, well, I still somehow put it off from my memory. I was mentioning the age of 4 to 7 because that was the really broad period in which it might have happened, but I was narrowing it down. I think this thing happened when I was 5 or 6. It was the one occasion.
I was going to say, as the grey came toward you, were you aware of still seeing the wardrobe in the background?
No, I was only looking at this thing coming at me. I mean, what I realised later, what I realise now, is that nothing was actually happening that time at that moment. It wasn't really a grey, and I realise now that pattern of the wardrobe, there was so much like.
Yes, I can see that.
That what it did, a memory which had been erased from me completely, it brought back the memory. So what I was reliving was an incredibly vivid memory. So it wasn't happening really there and then. I was reliving a memory of something which had happened, I don't know, 2 days before, a week before, 6 months before, I don't know. But it brought the memory back to me. So I was really, what I thought was an hallucination was an incredibly horrible experience that I had lived, but it had been wiped from my memory. I think there was a lot more than that. I mean, this is my adult intellect at work, but I think I had the experience before in this part of my childhood, which I don't recall, and I think that I knew very well to be terrified, and I knew that this was a very terrifying experience. In other words, I was only remembering a few seconds of what was a long experience I had, absolutely terrifying, but it's been wiped from my memory. And the wardrobe was so much like the face of a grey that it brought back that memory through the curtain. I was okay after that. I didn't know the word hallucination probably, but I guess I thought, well, I imagined it. And I was kind of annoyed with myself that how could I make something up so vivid, But it was always a memory, but I didn't think of it.
When your mother came, and we hear of night terrors as they're described, that's not an uncommon experience that people report in childhood. So did your mother, was she able to quickly calm you down?
I stayed in bed, and as far as I remember that, so far as I can recall, it was just the work of a moment. She came in, I was okay, it was all right, she left again. I don't think there was anything much that happened after that, and I fell asleep. but remembered in the morning. But I never looked back at it. I've had the memory without really going back to revisit it, you know. And then at the age of 7, somehow my mother was inspired for Christmas or a birthday. She gave me a book on astronomy, and wow, the subject of astronomy fascinated me, and I devoured the book. And in weeks, I could name 200 or 300 stars. I knew all about the planets, how many moons they had. I knew about the developing space program. Man hadn't reached the moon yet. They were going through the Mercury, which was one-man capsules, and then the Gemini system with 2 men orbiting the Earth, preparing to go to the moon. And I was following it all and deeply into astronomy. A year or so after that, because I was so into the subject, and it was a working class family, so we didn't lack for anything, but money was not abundant. But somehow my mother was so kind. I got up one morning, I think it was Christmas. She'd brought me an astronomical telescope, which was not cheap, and I would need to describe it because it comes into what happened next. That there were different kinds of astronomical telescopes, but one kind is called a reflector telescope, and it kind of points upward, obviously. But the way it works is the light from whatever you're looking at, the night sky, comes down the tube, and mine was a 4.5-inch diameter. So it comes down the tube, and it's about a yard or more long. And at the bottom of that tube, there's a concave mirror, and the concave mirror takes the light coming down, reflects it back upward, and near the top there's another mirror which reflects that light outward to your eyepiece, and the eyepiece is what magnifies it all. So I'm explaining it because using a reflector telescope, you're looking at the night sky, but you're actually looking kind of horizontal, and you may even be looking a little bit downwards in order to look up, because it's all being reflected. So you're not looking upwards, you're looking sideways like this. And the next thing that happened to me, I was out about every second night with my telescope, maybe 3 times a week. And I was nearly always alone, but occasionally I would get a fantastic vision of the moon or Jupiter with its moons. And I would call some neighbors over or some friends and say, look at this. I think mainly my mother, and say, take a look at this, just to show them. But 99% of the time I was alone. At the age of 9, so in 1962, I was out in the front garden where there was nothing, no buildings or anything, so you could see to the horizon. It was a great view of the night, and it was a moonless night. I'd spent quite a lot of time looking at things through the eyepiece, and it's natural after a while that your eye gets a little bit tired. And so I'm 9 years old here. 9 years old, 1962, never heard of UFOs. And I took my eye from the eyepiece, and I guess you kind of just rub it a bit because you've been doing this for half an hour or an hour. And maybe you stretch and you just kind of look up with your eyes. So I'm stressing this was not seen through a telescope, it was just my eyes. And I looked up and I knew the night sky inside out. I was an amateur astronomer, even though I was young. I knew everything that you see in the night sky. But directly above me, there was something that was like, wow, what? And it was a craft, definitely a craft. It was nothing natural at all. Nobody around I had never heard of UFOs. I didn't know anything about the subject. So the rational mind kicked in, and with a childlike 9-year-old mind, I thought, oh, it's a satellite, which is impossible because it was much bigger than that. So I saw this thing above me, and it was altogether it was almost the size of a full moon, but there was no moon out, totally dark night, and it was like a sphere, or I was seeing it from below. So, frankly, it could have been a flying saucer because I could simply see a sphere, and it was glowing with the light, just like the full moon, like a full moon, that kind of white silvery light. It was glowing very brightly, but coming out from the circle, It had what I call four aerials, kind of going to the 4 points of the compass. So it kind of looked like this, but of course it wasn't dark against a white sky. And this is a kind of the size a full moon would be compared to this. So it wasn't so spectacular. I knew the night sky, and this was far bigger than a planet or star. It was silent, and it was totally, totally still. And what I'd really point out, it was directly above me. And over time, when I came to know about UFOs, I've often thought, well, did I see it? Or was it watching me, first of all? Because it was directly above me. It wasn't even 2 degrees out. It was directly above me.
From your perspective, could you name any other object that it might have the same or similar size?
Yeah, well, the body of it was much smaller, but with the aerials coming out, it was about the size of a full moon. I call them aerials, but I would say it was 1,000 feet up at least. It wasn't near, but that means it was large. Oh, and not knowing about UFOs, I was 9 years old and my rational mind kicked in. I had to explain it. And I thought, oh, it's a satellite, which of course is impossible because satellites don't come that low and they move. You don't ever see a satellite like that. After a short while of looking at it, I thought, well, I've got to have somebody else to see this with me. So I ran inside to get my mother. And I was going, Mum, you've got to come and see this. Quick, you've got to come and see this. But she got up at a normal speed from the sofa. We walked through the rooms. We went outside and it was gone. Although when I was there on my own, it wasn't moving.
I'm wondering if you had any sort of feeling or sense of connection or such.
I was looking back. No, I felt totally normal in consciousness, simply amazed that I was seeing something I didn't expect to see.
Okay.
And I'd never connected these things together, even though I'd had 58 years on and off devouring all the books that come out, in recent years, the podcast. At my final year at primary school, and I know when it was because we used to go each year to a different room and a different teacher. So this was my final year at primary school. I was 11 years old, and out of the blue, I developed what very approximately a sinus problem. There was nothing else people would call it, but it was like nothing I've ever heard of. It was so intense and so dreadful. And I don't remember day one or how it began, but I think it began very quickly. And I'm afraid the description is a bit grotty, but I've got to describe it because we're talking about sinus trouble. And for some reason, very high up in my nasal cavity, not in my nose, but as high up as it could come from, I could feel there was a constant production of really thick gunk, to use the technical phrase. It was constantly being produced, so that if I blew my nose and I was clear, I'd be producing again straight afterwards, and I would feel the upper part filling up, and then it would be coming down very thick down my nostrils. And of course, I was a school child, and when you're at school, you're in the classroom. It got to the point about every 20 minutes or so, it would start to make an appearance. So I had to blow my nose. But the amount that would come out and the appearance was dreadful and terribly embarrassing if anybody saw it. No pain, just the inconvenience and the embarrassment, which I felt as a child, but probably would as an adult as well. You had to put your hand to ask permission to leave the classroom. And there's no way I could blow all this stuff out of my nose in front of people. And my mother arranged that I could just leave the classroom without putting my hand up, so it wasn't so embarrassing. I mean, a class would last about an hour, and I would probably have to leave twice or at least once during each class, and then go through the same thing again between classes. And I would go to the boys' toilet at school. I don't remember what I did at home, but it was a similar thing. Now, I couldn't use handkerchiefs because there was so much being produced. I would have needed 50 handkerchiefs a day. And a normal tissue like Kleenex, a paper white tissue, was nowhere near sufficient because the amount that came out was tremendous and I had to blow hard. So a tissue wasn't sufficient. So what I used was like a olive green color and they're very strong. So I used those. And there was so much stuff would have been produced that I would use one of these big, strong green paper towels and fill it with a whole load of horrible, thick green gunk. That was only the beginning because there was a lot more left. So I would have to fill a second one. And then to really clear myself, I would have to fill a third one.
I mean, it's really extreme, isn't it? Awful for you.
Yeah. Yes, because I would do this. I was in the habit because it was being produced all day long, every day. I would clear everything out. But even as I was walking back into the classroom, I could feel it forming again. It was just like you could watch your clock. That you had like maybe 20 minutes.
Did you manage to sleep with this going on?
I've been thinking about that. I did. I don't know how that worked. I don't know. When I was awake, this was constant through my days. So obviously my mother knew, and it's not the kind of thing that's going to kill you. It's not serious in that kind of a way. You're not going to lose an arm or a leg, but it was a dreadful thing to have, and it was terrible. She must have taken me to an NHS doctor, but I don't remember, and they wouldn't have known what to do, because the only thing I remember is she must have been advised to take me to a specialist. So she took me to a specialist to do with that kind of problem, I guess. Paid quite a lot of money for somebody working class in those days. This was 1964. And I wasn't expecting what he did. He took the story down, didn't know what to do. And he must have said something like, open your mouth as if you're in the dentist. So I opened my mouth. I'm 11 years old. And before I knew it, he put his hand in my mouth. And I didn't even know such a thing could be done. He put his hand in my mouth and put his finger right up the back of my throat and into my nasal cavity. I must have felt around there. So when it was happening, it was really traumatic for a little boy because I wasn't even expecting it. There was no warning. But then he took his finger out and said he couldn't detect anything. And he'd been paid money, good money. He was meant to be a specialist. He'd not detected anything. He'd obviously never come across anything like this before. So I remember that I guess he felt he had to earn his money. So he gave a diagnosis and he said, yes, it'll probably go away when he's 18 years old. And even then, I thought, he's probably just making this up. But I didn't know, I thought maybe something will happen or maybe I'll have to wait till I'm 18 years old. But it just carried on. He had no cure. He'd never heard of anything like it. And so this thing was carrying on. And the time frame of how long it lasted, I think it was at least half the academic year. So it was at least 6 months this was going on. And it might have been 5 months, it might have been 7 months. I just know most of that academic year, my final year at primary school, this is how my day went. And because it was called a sinus problem, my mother excused me from swimming lessons. The school didn't have a pool, but on a Friday, I think, a bus would take the children to a swimming pool. And I had the slight embarrassment of being separated out. My mother thought it would be bad because I had a sinus problem. So I don't know what I did. I spent half the day at school on my own. I just had to wait for them all to come back and tell me how it went. And I felt a bit left out, but I already had learned to swim, so I didn't miss out. Anyway, so one day I went to the toilet at school, one of these typical trips to clear my nose about every 20 minutes or so. Usual thing, really strong green paper towel. And I don't remember if it was the first one or the second one or the third one. It might have been the very final third one that I used. And I blew my nose hard. Most of the gunk had already come out. I should say, sorry for the description, but this problem was so bad that I blew my nose. there was loads of the stuff in this tissue at one point. And as I took the tissue away, there were still two streams of the stuff from each nostril attached to the tissue. And I could actually hold the tissue at arm's length like that. And there would still be these two things coming out of each nostril. That's how thick and how much of it there was. It was extraordinary.
Poor thing. Absolutely awful to go through as well. I mean, how awful for you.
Yeah. Except this time I'm talking about, I blew my nose. I think it was the final hard blow to really clear my nose. And it was like, what? And I looked into the tissue, and there was a small technological device. It was artificial. It was not natural. And if I tried to give you a lot of detail, I'd be making it up. So I can only tell you what I do know. It was cylindrical in shape. So you're talking about the shape of what I don't know about other countries like the USA, but if you have to change a fuse in a plug in the UK, the shape of a fuse, that's cylindrical. It was about that kind of shape, but I don't remember exactly. And it must have been smaller than a fuse because a fuse is too big to come out of a nostril. Just with my rational mind today, I'm saying it must have been more than a quarter of an inch, but maybe not more than half an inch long. But it was long enough to see it in detail, and I could see it was an artificial device. And it wasn't just a cylinder. I don't remember the detail, but it had like tendrils coming out. But the tendrils were like metallic, I think. They were not biological, like from a caterpillar. They were part of the device. So it was a cylindrical thing. It was a piece of technology, and it had these things coming out. And I don't remember the detail of where they were coming out from. I didn't spend long looking at it.
Did it have a very different colour?
Well, it was metallic, so I can only guess that it had a metallic silver colour. Yeah, if it had a strange colour, I would recall that. So I think it was a metallic, like silver metal. But it was surrounded by a sphere. It was in the middle of a sphere which surrounded it completely. And the sphere was a green substance, which was definitely biological in appearance. I was 11 years old, still a little boy, didn't know anything about abductions, and I just saw that, the sphere of green substance, and I thought, oh, it's fungus. And then the idea entered my mind, well, maybe this problem I've got, a spore of fungus might have gone up my nose, settled high up, and grown into this big sphere. And that could be the cause of my problem. And somehow I wasn't thinking about the technological thing inside it. I was thinking of this sphere of fungus, that maybe that was the cause of my problem. But now, using my rational mind, I'm saying there's a technological thing surrounded by a sphere. So the sphere must have been translucent to see through it, to see the thing. So all I can remember is there was a cylindrical technological device, definitely not natural. It had some kind of detail like tendrils or something coming out of it. And it was surrounded by a biological kind of green sphere of something.
So did you touch it?
No, I didn't. No. I think, I mean, for one thing, nowadays I would be fascinated with a scientific point of view. I guess I was on a timeline because I was out of the class. The class was still happening and I had to get back. And I didn't have the awareness that it was something really, really, really extraordinary. And maybe because I was only 11, I didn't focus too much on, well, how can a metallic object come out of my nose? But I remember that's what I saw. But I had to get back to the class. So I just binned it. But I was thinking, well, that might be the cause of the problem. And it was. That was the end of my problem. I said earlier it was like joining the dots 20 months ago. These were separate dots in my memory, and they're clear memories. But somehow I came across the Betty and Barney Hill case in the newspapers in 1965 when I was 12. It fascinated me. Well, I dived right into the subject of UFOs And the Betty and Barney Hill case was an abduction.
Well, that's right. That was
But
actually even earlier. That was 61, though you might have read about it in 65.
65 is when it became public because they were serializing
Right.
the book about it by John Fuller, which was called The Interrupted Journey. And I instantly knew that I believed in all this. And so from then on, the age of 12, I was really interested, always have been, in the subject. But out of all the reading I've done, and I've read Whitley Strieber and John Mack, and I've read all the books, and I never put two and two together. It's very strange that something stopped me thinking about myself. I mean, I was reading about implants, and it never occurred to me, hello, look in the mirror. It never occurred to me. And then 20 months ago, I was just turned 70. So I'd known about the subject for 58 years. And for some reason, I was sitting there and the dots joined.
Bit
You
of a
know, it's
light
like
bulb moment.
I just sat there stunned for 2 or 3 hours. And I've got a very close friend in the city. And I told him, because we can share anything. And he knows about the subject of UFOs. He's introduced me to other people who've seen them. So I told him, but the dots I was joining, I thought, well, I saw a grey. That was a grey when I was about 5 or 6 years old. But it wasn't actually there. It was a memory of being with a grey. But I don't remember the actual event, but that was a flash of the memory and the fear, the terrible fear. So that was a grey for sure. And then I remember, well, I always knew, but I saw a UFO when I was 9, and it was directly above me because I did realize that was a UFO. From the age of 12, I realized that. So I always knew I'd seen a UFO. So I thought, well, that was a grey. And that was a UFO 3 years, 4 years later above me, directly above me, which disappeared conveniently when I went to get my mother. But wait a minute, I still would have not really thought much about it. The clincher was, that was an implant. I mean, it was obviously an implant. And I realize now, I've read about how they are often surrounded by a kind of biological material. And clearly what was happening is my body was trying to reject it. My body was not accepting it. And my body did reject it, but it took roughly half a year.
And did you ever get anything like nosebleed? Oh
No,
my
no.
goodness. So I've had interaction. Let's see if I can communicate.
I'm not interested in them. I've been on a spiritual path to the best of my ability through my life. So I like to control my emotions and I like to be in a good spirit. And over the months after my realization in October 23, thinking about it on several occasions, I became extremely angry. I had the most extreme example. I mean, this is abuse. This is abuse. And I hate what they did. At one point, I thought, well, if I could just get aboard that craft or one of their craft with an automatic rifle, and if they could not stop me mentally, I would just blow them apart. And I had absolute hatred when I was thinking that. And then my normal self is like, David, wait a minute. Do you want to walk around with this feeling inside you? And I'm able to kind of change myself quickly. But I've had several periods I had to quickly get hold of anger.
I mean, you're not the only one, of course. I hear what you say about the abuse.
The thing is, Joanna, all I know is this memory of seeing a grey coming towards me and being terrified out of my mind. And it was a memory that I experienced in my bedroom, to make it clear. It brought the memory back. Then I've seen the UFO directly above me. That was definite. And the implant was definite. So it's concrete proof that I once had in my hands. But then it makes me think, how many times? What happened that I don't know? Because the real experience, like being taken, the thing being put in me, I've got no memory. So I don't know how often that happened. how often they took me. I don't know what they did to me. I'm not bothered now. It's all behind me, I feel. I've had no experiences like that since I was 11 that I know of.
Could you put to those experiences any developmental aspects of your own nature, or perhaps more psychically open? Anything like that?
Not really. I would say that coming across the subject of UFOs in general, which was a little bit after, about half a year after the implant came out, that opened my mind to all kinds of possibilities. But I naturally seem to have become interested. I think I was born and it was always going to happen, that I became interested in esotericism, investigated the paranormal in a scientific way. I was experimenting on remote viewing at university as my project, and did ESP experiments. And then my spiritual beings I know and that I learn from. But I think that was always going to happen. I'm not saying I'm anything special, because abductions happen to all kinds of people, but they might have picked me out because I was a little bit different. That might be why they chose me.
Certainly, I know that from people I've spoken to who are not aware in that layer of life or experience, one of the things the abduction does for them, whether they like it or not, and not many people like it, it opens them up to the spiritual path. That gentleman I was telling you about, called Mike Smith, whose story I spent nearly 3.5 years writing with him because his experience was extreme. And he also had a sinus issue. And he was a singer, a musician. And that was how he earned his living. And when he came back one time, he was having his, as he calls it, sinus problems. And he flushed his sinuses out. He said it was a yogic technique of flushing them out with water. And he said, out came an implant. He didn't know what it was. He wasn't what he called awake at the time. So he had a download at age 44. That's part of the title of the book. But he did have enough awareness to keep that. So he put it in a soap dish, and he actually thought at the time it must be from a filling. The only one filling he had in his entire life was when he went into the army, which he experienced immediate abduction, I mean within a week of being there, and he had some dental work done, which I think is to do with tracking from the military. But that implant might have been from the UFO, but the military were tracking him in other ways. And when he put this little object, which sounds a little bit like yours, he described it as a miniature 2.2 bullet. So that is just fascinating. And it turns out that the ETs came back to retrieve their object in the night. Thank you, David. That is really amazing. So it's 3 events. So there's clearly something that's gone on for you.
There was a bit more after the first one of A Memory of a Grey. I woke up one morning, and this is more vague. I thought, what happened last night? I'll be very quick with this. And I had a memory which was kind of like being in a trance, standing in my bedroom, and it was dark at night. And it was so vague, I wasn't sure. I was trying to remember, is this a dream or was it real? But what I remembered was standing in my room in a strange mental state and just thinking that I knew something was outside my window and going away, and the curtains were drawn. So I opened the curtains and I saw a witch on a broomstick flying away. And when I remembered that, I thought, oh, it was a dream, obviously. I mean, I knew by then that there's no such thing as witches on broomsticks and Santa Claus. I was old enough to know. So I thought, well, that was a really weird thing to remember. But it still seems like it actually kind of happened. My adult mind is wondering if I was seeing something departing and they change your memory. It was soon after that thing with the grey. I was very young.
I'm sure that if you find yourself standing there as, in your logical mind, and you're aware of the logic of your mind and thinking, witch on a broomstick, maybe they just picked out one of the memories that you'd seen in a book, maybe.
I mean, it sounds so silly, that can be dismissed, but there's the memory of a grey. I saw a UFO for sure. I was an amateur astronomer. I knew the night sky. It was definitely a craft. And then it was definitely a metallic object out of my nasal cavity.
It's absolutely fascinating, David. And that you remembered, 20 months ago when you were 70.
Well, I wanted to get it on record after thinking about it because, well, I just think it should be on the record. And then I'm just going to not look back and just look forward in my life from now on. I wanted to get it off my chest, really.
Well, I think that's great. And thank you for doing that. Thank you for being brave enough to share it, because it doesn't matter that it's not a Betty and Barney Hill event. Clearly, there's something being going on, and there's a relationship between us and these others, whatever that is. Any final words?
Oh, thank you for being there. I first located you on the internet and spoke to you months ago, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Okay. One quick thing. I read 44, the book.
Oh, you did?
I read it in 2.5 days, and
wow.
I've read a lot of books, but I've never read anything. I mean, every page has something on it.
I know, that's
What?
why I spent 3.5 years working with the man, because he was traumatized. I think he was suffering from PTSD. And it took me a long time. I've come from counseling and regression work. We didn't do regression or anything, but a lot of work to help him. But he said it somehow woke him up. I'm pleased you've read it, and then you'll know about the 2-2 bullet.
Yeah, it's very familiar. Yeah.
Thank you again for taking the time to be with me and the ET Newsroom.
Thank you very much. Thank you.